genuinely not here, please do try to get them over here as fast as possible, so that they don't just like completely miss the debate. Because as far as I can see
We are
every.
here.
Okay, thank you for replying. Okay, then everybody's here. So
Hadzri is here.
yeah, I heard from everybody else. I just hadn't heard anything from opposition whip. Without further ado, then Prime Minister, please start your speech whenever you are ready.
Can everyone hear me? Chair. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start. Madam Chair, on the motion, this House will cooperate with any government in order to combat non-state actors like terrorist groups who seriously abuse human rights. Our side strongly believes that this motion should stand. So as the Prime Minister, I'll be giving a few things to this debate today. So firstly, I'll be giving definitions, then our characterization and our justifications. Then I'll be giving a few arguments on this. Okay, so firstly, definitions. So what are non-state actors exactly? They are an individual organization that has significant political influence, but is not allied to any particular country or state. And so with adding up with who seriously abuse human rights, those are like armed resistant groups or terrorist groups, etc. Okay, so characterization, right? And so what exactly are armed resistance groups or terrorist groups? We would count them like ISIS, which are not part of the government, but still has a huge influence in this Middle East area and are doing frequent terrorism, which is the exact, and also abusing a lot of human rights. So which is the exact example of this.
Point.
Okay, and so what is exactly is cooperating with the government, right? So they would work with or collaborate with the government in means but not limited to like military or economic sanctions, which is like freezing assets, so to stop the economic supply from those terrorist groups, right? And so what are abusing human rights, which is necessarily restricting those people's freedom of speech, freedom to live, and freedom to go wherever you want, and so wherever you want, which is all those kinds of freedom. Okay, and so why is this justified to use such a hard means, which is military or economic sanctions, onto those so-called non-state actors, right? Because we see that they are abusing human rights, right? And this is a huge problem because every human deserves to have human rights. And so we believe that in order to let those people have the human rights, there must be strong action made, and so in which is to collaborate with the government and to make the most effective move to stop those non-state actors, which also leads to my first point, which talks about effectiveness. So why is it more effective? Because we see that the government has more resources, right? As a government of a state or a state or a country, they definitely have more financial stuff and even have a larger military, etc. And to combat those state groups, right? As we see that in those non-state actors, just as the example we gave, which is ISIS, those are huge groups, right? And so for those huge groups, we believe we need to use those government resources, just military, which a normal group wouldn't have don't have those military power, and those intelligence reports from those governments, as every government has those intelligence, which is more effective in combating those non-state actors, such as ISIS. They relied on intelligence from different countries too, and for economic burdens too, because you see that non-state actors need to have money to keep them running. They need to buy weapons. They need to buy weapons. They need to have continued financial support too, right? And so we see that by only collaborating with the government, we can effectively stop those non-state actors because they are so powerful. Without the government, we simply have no power to stop them at all. And so what this means is a deterrent effect too. Because we see that if you no thank you, I said already, don't spam POIs, please. Okay, so what does it mean if you collaborate with the government? Is that there will be a deterrent effect. So why is it so? Because when you collaborate with the government, it means that it means that the government and people are stressing the importance on this thing, and people will think that this is important. And when people think that it's important, there will be less non-state actors who will dare to have such a high political intervene while abusing human rights, and so which leading to a deterrent effect. Because there are previous examples of those. If they are previous examples of collaborating government and successfully combating those non-state actors, they will definitely not do it again. And so the last of this is public image. So the most important thing about these are those helping those people who are abusing human rights too. And so why is it so important? Because when you collaborate with the government, as what I said before, as a deterrent effect, same as having a strong image. So when you have a strong image, those people will have more trust in the government. So when you have more trust in the government, more people will help to combat those nasty actors. And so thus making the movement, making the operation even more effective, even make it more effective and for saving the people. So what I have told you today about this, what I have told you today in my speech, so about why I've given you characterization and justifications, and I've told you why it is more effective for them to collaborate with the government, and then why it will help the public image and give a deterrent effects, and therefore making it very effective. And so, thank you, and I'm very, very, very proud to compose.
Thank you, Speaker, for your speech. Leader of Opposition, start whenever you're ready, please.
Hello, can everyone hear?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I'll start. Ladies and gentlemen, a few things I'll be doing in my speech today. Firstly, I'll be extending on and elaborating on my partner's case while providing a few extensions in that direction. Secondly, I'll be offering some rebuttals to OO's case and tell you why we take this case over OO and why their points do not stand. So, but before I get to all of that stuff, I'll do some rebuttals for OO. So OO had basically one really large point in this debate, and that is that how the government is inherently bad, and like if you have external interference and it's not justified and stuff, and how it will lead to oppressive governments and abuse of power and everything like that. A few layers of responses. Firstly, we would like to raise that, like, if assuming that this house is a citizen, then it will be your right and duty to actually protect your country, regardless of how bad the government inherently is. And secondly, even if you're not a citizen, and if this house were any country or any city in the world, or any person, any stakeholder in this debate, it would still be justified, even if the government is oppressive, even if the government is inherently bad in itself. We still think that it is justified to help the government get rid of, for example, like terrorist groups or non-state actors that abuse human rights, because that's not actually related to, that doesn't actually help. We don't see how it actually helps the government in their oppression, or for example, their authoritarian ways, and we don't see how we're actually benefiting them. And we see that even if the government is bad, even if it's corrupted, even if they're abusing their power, at least if we cooperate with them, we at least rid them of the non-state actors, and which is what we try to do in this debate, regardless of how bad the government is set. And we also tell you that the opposition are talking about in a world where the government is bad, and like we see that there's also a possible case where the government, for example, is going to be cooperating with you. But even if we take them at their worst case, I already offered you some rebuttals to tell them why their case doesn't stand. And also, as a side note, we would like to raise out that the ISIS group was largely exterminated because of the US and the so-called external interference. So we don't see how that actually is a bad thing, right? Okay, so now moving on to my like extensions and also further elaborating on my partner's case. Firstly, on effectiveness, how it actually achieves effectiveness is because the government has more resources, and the more resources, for example, like manpower. And I would like to raise an example. For example, in Chinese history, right, like in the Song Dynasty, China was split into two portions, and then people collaborated with the government to actually like unite China. And my point of even if the historical facts aren't important enough, my point from this is that people have a huge impact and can sway the flow of how things work, and therefore it's very important for people to cooperate with the government, no matter if it's an external or internal force. We see that the people have a huge impact on this, and I'll be further elaborating that. Secondly, my further elaboration, how this actually works, right? Because this actually boosts the morale, even if the people, like even if you don't buy how the people add more to the manpower of the government, which is a practical effect. Secondly, even if you don't buy that, we say that it boosts the morale, which ultimately also boosts the effectiveness, right? So we see that these two things work hand in hand, because when you see that, for example, your government, the people like the people are actually trying to actively combat this, we see that not only is it much more likely to be effective in itself because of the manpower, we see that the morale is raised and people have much more trust in the government because they're not like, oh, the government isn't care, they're turning a blind eye, oh, the government is incapable or anything like that. We see that the government is actually trying to solve these problems. This not only is effective in raising the social order because it's a higher chance of success, secondly, it also raises the morale and is much more likely to succeed in itself in the second match. Secondly, justifications. Because obviously it's kind of intuitive that human rights are important, and I'll be telling you why it's a responsibility if you are a citizen to actually protect your government, and how the other countries actually would want to do it, and like why they could do it, and how it is actually effective, right? Because if like we all know that human rights is extremely important, and I don't think that needs much explanation. For example, your freedom of speech, your freedom to live in the first place, because our society wouldn't have existed without your freedom to live. So the other countries, if they rid like terrorism and stuff like that, it's also like inherently good for them as well, right? Because like you're helping the other countries, and this establishes much better relationships between countries. And even if you don't buy that, we see that there's we don't see any disadvantage of other countries helping as I raised the like how US helped and largely exterminated ISIS. Lastly, a counterfactual. When people don't like really cooperate to fight, this not only lowers the effectiveness of the whole thing, and this decreases the social order because it's much harder to actually combat these non-state actors like terrorist groups who abuse human rights, and we see that the morale actually drops, the practical effectiveness also drops, and this is what we think that is important and crucial to cooperate with the government to combat these non-state actors who are ruining our society and who are ruining human rights, which we prove are so important in this debate, and I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you, Speaker, for your speech. Deputy Leader of Opposition, you can start as soon as you are ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Chair, we don't think throwing more fire into the fuel can solve the problem at hand where both houses wanted to solve, especially in government. But it's very important that it's a policy debate and both government benches needed to mechanize their debates or mechanize their policies into how we see on the process of how when you collaborate into these governments, how will they not go rogue? But there are so many questions being underlined and unanswered in both government benches. But before that, I'd like to go to CG first because I think they're quite redundant. But the only thing I think CG went a little bit far off is that they took the trade-off that if these collaborations between government will take the far extent to kill these terrorists and breach human rights, they're absolutely fine with it. But they're never analyzed to you like the benefits that will be reaped afterwards and how it wouldn't like escalate war as a whole, right? We think that number one, as this premise was only brought in CG, you don't deplete the anger of these terrorist groups at all, right? Instead, you have surviving of these terrorist groups, or they're going to garner more terrorist people to join their groups to be more driven, to be more radicalized, right? Because you don't have the initiative to actually go on the table and negotiate with them, because I've never heard any of the incentives coming from that, right? Also, when they garner a lot of terrorist people, terrorists to enter their terrorist group, we think that now you create an endless cycle of war because you constantly anger them instead of actually coming to the table, and it escalates more, then what are the harms in the government that they do not want to engage? Number one is that you hurt innocent civilians even more. You don't solve your short-term benefits or your long-term benefits. You're wasting these innocent lives even more. We think that this was the burden that government had failed severely in actually proving, and you don't save anyone in your side, and the vulnerable groups just fall down. But we think it's important that where OG has brought to you like the collaboration for increase of resources, I think the whole mechanism is mutually exclusive with the alternative that only CO has brought and not OO. We think that they never clearly mechanize how their world looks like, and if you don't properly mechanize your policy, your benefits are not mutually exclusive, because you have your alternative like your international community, like your United Nations, your G7 that I'll elaborate further. But you have to analyze those how you can mitigate the objective you want terrorists to not radicalize further. There was no analysis on what are the incentives of these terror groups to actually come to the table and negotiate, but you have not proved any process of how these collaborations work at all, right? But I think it's also important to acknowledge that terrorist groups are not easy to handle. It takes years for them to moderate, right? Like United Nations like takes stages to deal with them because they have procedures that they have to follow when they want to deal with terrorist groups. So then we think that the objective that they want just falls completely. We think that OG and CG just doesn't complete this debate. But I think what is the alternative that CO brings into this table in comparison with OO? We have existing international bodies that actually are effectively working in combating terrorists and are actually having to go into this, right? We think that you have your G7, you have your NATO countries, including a USA, Germany, and France, undertake a wide range of military operations and missions, right? So we don't see like how it works in your policy. Either one of these government would just go rogue because we don't know whether it's consensus or whatnot, right? But it's also important that when you have United Nations, it symbolizes the peacemaking of the conflict that is happening underground. For example, your Taliban's and your ISIS, right? The reason why they want to actually go on the table is because they know that United Nations do not want to make the situation work. They work based on sanctions, but actually to initiate neutrality, to not escalate anger in these terrorist groups to hurt other people more, right? So that's why you have your Taliban's having to or wanting to negotiate. And we think that under our side, we have this bargaining power to understand these terrorist groups on what they want in comparison with your collaboration of government that ideally you have not explained to us the incentive of whether they would actually go rogue and the trade-off that you take. But it's important to also understand to having the proper method to combat these terrorist groups. There are many and various interests of terrorist groups. You don't necessarily have your all big terrorist groups there. You also have small terrorist groups that only want attention to have the things that they want. And the reason why they are established, they want attention. For example, they're like poor and whatnot. So their acts, for example, kidnapping a whole village, right? Then threatens to kill these villages. Your collaboration of government may probably just go forward without actually having to dissecting what is the real problem. We just take up firearms and just start killing these terrorists. We don't think that is the solution that you solve, but you easily solve this by actually, for example, United Nations easily giving this money, for example, where United Nations has done, because they are a symbol of peace and they do not want to escalate the war that is at hand, right? It is also a restraint for all other countries inside the United Nations to not go rogue by abiding human rights as well, right? We still think that under your world, when the governments collaborating goes rogue, and rogue, not vogue, that CO has solved or safe to assure you that these collaboration, to assume that these collaboration of governments are just going to hurt these terrorist groups even more, and it's escalating wars, and hence you have to prove that burden. But I think it's too late. So proud to oppose.
May we please have the opposition whip come up to conclude the debate? Is the opposition whip there?
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, go ahead when you're ready.
I think there's a reason why certain non-state actors, despite the huge amount of capital that their enemies possess, despite the huge military power that their enemy possess, they still may manage to sustain those sort of hardships and continue to exist until today. For instance, Taliban managed to exist in Afghanistan despite the huge military power that United States have. Hamas still exists in Gaza despite the fact that their opponents are Israel and United States, which have such tremendous amount of military power and advanced weapons. Because the core idea of non-state actors, which Aimi has said, to justify why simply this policy will not deplete terrorist groups because they themselves have certain ideology and a strong ideology. And the policy that opposition brings into this debate, as Aimi has said, will not be the same as the image of peace that the United Nations have. Instead, what the reaction of these groups will have against those sort of cooperation that government want is an image of aggression. They will be seen as invaders who want to oppress them, who want to take their rights on the ground. So we believe that in the context of today's debate and today's world, where most of the times terrorists are fighting against us not in a traditional war such as in the World War One. It only takes one person in Europe to believe in those kind of extremist values to explode himself in a way that exploit himself and cause terrorism. So we don't think that the mere fact of you having more tanks or having more weapons simply can instantly eradicate this problem, which I think we on site closing opposition managed to engage with the current reality. But so all in all, site closing opposition managed to prove to you the urgency of being peaceful to eradicate specific and complex and sophisticated problems such as terrorist groups. So after that, we need to recognize the several problems that exist in government bench. So firstly, uh, opening government said that first, they say that more resources equal to more efficient operations. But on the same breath, Prime Minister state that ISIS has been exterminated by the United States. So there are no sense of urgency that opening government creates to explain to us why we need more money when he himself actually believe that current efforts are sufficient to eradicate those kind of problems. But secondly, about freedom to live and fundamental rights and whatnot. Uh, the problem is those kind of violation of human rights will still exist on your side because the government that will cooperate are also the government who violate human rights. But secondly, it will make you, even if you want to say that, oh, violations will be much less in your world, but we don't think that it will be in the long run, we be better on their side. Because once we cooperate, we legitimize those kind of governments when people see our leaders and their leaders shaking hands, signing treaties with Bashar al-Assad. It sends a message to the people that these leaders that are problematic are legitimate and are recognized by the Western bloc. But secondly, uh, but then secondly, uh, Colombian government also said about like more information to fight with non-state actors. Sure, more information might be harmful, but also might be beneficial, but also might be harmful. Why? Because when you cooperate with problematic countries to fight vague vague concept of non-state actors who seriously commit abuse of human rights, you create a possibility where these problematic countries who lack transparent democratic institutions such as courts and legislatures, they have the tendency to just create fake information to label a certain groups that they hate and they want to discriminate as terrorists. Hence, we are forced to cooperate with them to exterminate them. For example, China labeling Uyghur, killing innocent Chinese people. Hence, they in Shanghai, and hence they force the Western Bloc to eradicate those kind of Muslims. So we don't think that the kind of information that side closing opposition want into this debate is actually will be more beneficial on our side of the house. So all in all, closing opposition believe that uh, we are dealing with specific issues that are not the same as any kind of war between a particular country and another country. We are dealing with non-state actors such as terrorist groups, which are much more complex in nature, which need to be dealt with a peaceful and harmonious ways instead of vague and problematic and aggressive kind of image. For that, we are proud to oppose.